On some quiet American streets, there is a strange kind of double life. Above ground, everything seems settled. There is a courthouse with warm stone steps, a row of brick storefronts with darkened second-floor windows, a diner that opens before sunrise, a pharmacy where the fluorescent lights hum softly late into the evening, a parking lot painted over so many times that older lines still faintly show through after rain. People pass through these places without thinking too much about what lies under them, because streets are good at giving the impression of finality. Pavement looks finished, sidewalks look permanent. Buildings, even when old, present themselves as the latest version of a place. And yet, below many of these ordinary streets, there are older passages, sealed corridors, forgotten rooms, utility tunnels, buried foundations, bricked-up doorways, and narrow routes that no longer appear on public maps. Sometimes they were built for storage, sometimes for coal, sometimes for steam lines, deliveries, drainage, or movement between buildings in winter. Sometimes they belonged to industries that disappeared so completely that only a few rusted fixtures remain. And sometimes they are harder to account for. A crew opens a section of ground during a repair and finds arched brickwork leading into darkness. A demolition uncovers a passage that seems to run farther than expected. A basement wall breaks open and reveals another wall behind it, then a void, then a corridor nobody using the building today had ever seen. Before we go any deeper into these buried passages, take a moment to settle in. And if you enjoy these slow walks through the quieter edges of history, you can subscribe and stay a while. I always like hearing where in the world people are listening from, and what hour the night has reached where they are. There is something fitting about tracing hidden spaces beneath sleeping streets while another city, somewhere else, is just beginning to go quiet. One of the reasons tunnel stories take hold so easily is that they begin in a place all of us recognize, not in a mythical landscape, but in a familiar one, a downtown block, a church cellar, the basement of an old hotel, the rear wall of a general store that closed decades ago. The mystery does not start with a lost civilization. It starts with the unsettling discovery that the world we walk through every day may not be the only version of that world. There may be an older one beneath it, still present in pieces, still carrying the shape of vanished habits and forgotten needs. That idea is not dramatic only because it is hidden. It is dramatic because it is ordinary. Across the United States, towns and cities were built, rebuilt, expanded, paved over, raised, lowered, connected, and repaired across generations. Streets changed elevation. Rivers were redirected. Fires erased blocks. Industrial growth demanded pipes, conduits, storage chambers, rail links, drainage routes, and service corridors. Businesses that once moved coal, ice, meat, clothing, paper, or medicine had practical reasons to create underground spaces. Hospitals linked buildings. Factories moved heat and power. Hotels connected kitchens and laundries. Breweries needed cool storage. Dense urban blocks needed ways to move goods without freezing workers in winter, or choking alleys with traffic above ground. And when the life that produced those spaces changed, the spaces often remained. That is one of the first truths beneath the mystery. A tunnel does not have to be ancient to become unknown. It only has to outlast the system that explained it. Once the business closes, once the original owner dies, once the records are scattered, once a block is redeveloped, once a city office moves or burns or discards a box of plans that seemed unimportant, a practical corridor can begin its second life, not as infrastructure, but as a question. American towns are especially good at producing that kind of question because they grew in layers rather than from a single unified plan. A place begins as a settlement beside water, rail, timber, ore, or road traffic. Then it expands. Then it commercializes. Then it modernizes. Then it changes again under pressure from cars, new building codes, shifting industries, and new materials. Each stage leaves behind something useful for the next stage, but not everything. Some spaces are repurposed, some are sealed, some are forgotten, because forgetting is cheaper than removing them. A city does not always erase its past. Very often, it simply builds over it. That is why so many of the most interesting tunnel discoveries happen during disruption: a foundation repair, a sewer project, an elevator retrofit, the removal of a collapsing floor. The tearing down of an old warehouse that had stood so long nobody could quite remember what it had first been built for. Beneath the visible structure, workers find evidence that the current building was never the whole story. A stairway descending where no stairway should be, brick arches blackened by soot, iron rings mounted into stone walls, a stretch of passage, too narrow for a road but too deliberate to be accidental, heading toward another property line. At first glance, many of these findings are easy to explain. Some are utility routes. Some are coal chutes, enlarged over time. Some are access passages between commercial buildings that once cooperated in ways modern tenants no longer do. In colder parts of the country, it made sense to connect structures below ground, especially institutions that operated constantly through winter. In industrial districts, moving steam, heat, or goods through underground channels reduced clutter above. In river cities, warehouses and basements adapted to changing street levels, floods, and shipping demands. In mining country, tunnels are part of the landscape itself, though not always in the way later rumors claim. In older entertainment districts, service routes, storage voids, and cellar connections multiplied beneath busy blocks. But the moment an explanation appears, another complication often follows. The tunnel seems older than the building it sits beneath. The direction makes no obvious sense. It ends in a bricked wall that once may have opened into another structure long since replaced. A local story insists it led to the courthouse, or the hotel, or the river, or a church, or the train depot. A faded newspaper clipping offers one version. A retired maintenance worker remembers another. A historian examining insurance maps finds a third possibility. Then an engineer looks at the masonry and says part of it was altered later, meaning the visible form may not reflect the original purpose at all. And so the tunnel begins to resist certainty. It helps, at this point, to imagine the life of one downtown block over 150 years. The first buildings are modest, practical, and close to the street. Their basements are shallow, meant for storage, coal, or food. Then commerce intensifies. A bank replaces a dry goods store. A larger hotel rises where a smaller structure once stood. A rear alley becomes more important than the front entrance for deliveries. Gas lines come in, then electricity, then telephones, then steam, then new plumbing, then central heat. Sidewalks are rebuilt. The street elevation changes slightly to improve drainage. Adjacent lots are merged and divided. A fire destroys half the block, but some foundation walls survive and are incorporated into new construction. A business owner knocks through a basement wall for extra storage. Another closes off an opening because of rats or water seepage. During a Prohibition era, perhaps a cellar gets a concealed partition or a short passage repurposed for reasons no one writes down plainly. Later, a city inspector marks part of the space unsafe and seals it. Decades after that, no one working above ground realizes that the basement geometry still preserves the shape of older decisions. By the time somebody rediscovers that buried space, it is no longer simply architecture. It is accumulated human intention, much of it undocumented. This is where the mood around tunnels becomes more interesting than the usual claim that there are secrets everywhere. In most cases, there is no need to invent secrets. Ordinary history, when compressed underground and left without explanation, becomes eerie by itself. A passage that once carried coal can feel almost ceremonial when the bins are gone and only the arched ceiling remains. A delivery corridor can seem like evidence of a hidden social order once the street above has forgotten the labor that sustained it. A service route between buildings can look clandestine if the businesses it connected no longer exist. The mystery does not always come from what the tunnel was. Often it comes from the disappearance of the world that made it understandable. There are American cities where this layered feeling is especially strong, not because every rumor is true, but because the ground genuinely contains multiple ages of urban life pressed together. In older river towns, basements can become windows into previous street levels, previous flood strategies, previous trading habits. In industrial cities, whole subsurface systems once existed to move heat, power, and materials with a logic modern pedestrians never see. In districts rebuilt after fire or economic transformation, fragments of one era become hidden foundations for another. And in some Western towns, where boom and bust cycles change the shape of settlement quickly, passages associated with boarding houses, stores, saloons, municipal functions, or transport have had enough time to detach from clear memory. The American imagination has always responded strongly to that detachment. There is a reason every town seems to have at least one story about a tunnel leading from someplace respectable to someplace disreputable, from a public building to a private house, from a church to a riverbank, from a hotel basement to the edge of town. These stories persist because they satisfy a particular emotional pattern. They suggest that underneath civic order there was always another system at work, discreet, practical, hidden from polite view. Sometimes the story is partly true. Sometimes the tunnel existed, but the popular reason attached to it came later. Sometimes there was a storage passage, and later generations turned it into a smuggling route in memory because that felt more vivid than coal delivery or winter access. Sometimes there never was a tunnel at all, only a sequence of connected cellars retold over time as a single secret corridor. Still, even the false stories tell us something useful. They tell us that the ground beneath a town feels historically unfinished. People sense that older systems are still down there, even if they no longer know their names. Where records are thin, imagination moves in. But imagination does not appear out of nowhere. It usually gathers around something real, a sealed door, a basement arch, a strange draft of cold air through a wall, a collapsed chamber found during excavation, a municipal map with unexplained lines, an inaccessible void mentioned in an old maintenance log. There is also a physical reason these places hold on to mystery so stubbornly. Underground spaces age differently from the world above. Sunlight does not bleach them. Foot traffic does not constantly update them. A room can remain closed for 40 years and emerge with the same proportions, the same soot, the same hooks in the wall, the same pipe brackets, the same smell of damp brick and dust. Time passes above in traffic lights, new storefront lettering, fresh paint, changing ownership. Below, time can pause just long enough to make rediscovery feel uncanny. Not because the space is supernatural, but because it has been spared the visible rhythm by which we usually measure historical change. Imagine a worker crouched under a commercial block during renovation, his flashlight catching on brick laid by hands long dead. He is not only looking at a passage, he is looking at labor that expected to be useful, not mysterious. He is seeing the remains of a practical decision that outlived the people who made it. That is one of the quietest and strongest feelings in historical work. Not the thrill of conspiracy, but the recognition that much of the past survives in forms no longer attached to explanation. And then, sometimes, the explanation that seems obvious begins to wobble. Suppose a tunnel beneath a downtown block appears to connect two buildings that were not standing at the same time, at least not in the forms we see today. Or a chamber is found beneath a structure supposedly built after the local industry that would have justified such a chamber had already declined. Or a passage seems to head toward a building associated in local memory with one purpose, while surviving maps suggest another. A tunnel may have been modified, extended, shortened, sealed, or repurposed. Brick styles alone may not date every alteration. Municipal records may mention construction, but not clearly enough to resolve which section belongs to which phase. Insurance maps may show basement outlines but not interior detail. Oral histories may preserve useful clues while also blending generations of speculation into a single neat story that history itself cannot confirm. In other words, a tunnel is rarely one moment preserved intact. It is often several moments layered inside each other. That matters because when people hear the phrase mysterious tunnels beneath America, they often imagine one grand hidden network waiting to be exposed. The reality is more subtle, and in some ways more haunting. America has many buried passages, but they do not all belong to the same story. They belong to many local stories, shaped by commerce, weather, urban growth, labor, fear, transport, religion, vice, illness, engineering, and convenience. Some were always official, some were semi-official, some were improvised, some were private, some were likely exaggerated. Some are barely tunnels at all by modern expectation, more like linked basements, passage rooms, or service voids. Yet the reason historians remain interested is not because every claim survives scrutiny. It is because even after the obvious inventions are stripped away, enough real underground complexity remains to show that the visible map of American history is incomplete. The buried parts matter because they reveal how people actually moved, worked, stored, hid, heated, protected, and adapted. Above-ground history tends to favor facades. Courthouses, mansions, churches, depots, hotels, factories, monuments. Underground history favors process. Fuel arriving before dawn, laundry moving in cold weather, heat passing through pipes, food stored in darkness, workers using routes the public never saw, supplies transferred between buildings without exposing them to mud, snow, theft, or scrutiny. If the public life of a town was staged at street level, much of its functional life happened below. And below is also where change becomes hard to read. When an upstairs room is remodeled, the transformation is obvious. Walls move, paint changes, windows widen. But when a basement passage is sealed, a city can forget it with astonishing speed. Especially if the businesses involved vanish and the next generation sees only a blank wall. 40 years later, somebody tapping that wall during repairs hears the hollow space beyond, and suddenly the old uncertainty returns. Who built it? Where does it go? Why was it closed? Was it for deliveries? Steam? Bootlegging? Storage? Escape? Did it connect to the next property? Or once continue farther and then collapse? Was it one tunnel? Or part of a chain? Is it older than the current structures? Or simply a practical feature whose paperwork never survived? Questions like these do not always lead to dramatic answers. Often they lead to patient, local, fragmentary work. A property deed, a Sanborn map, a newspaper ad mentioning a basement renovation, a fire report, a photograph taken before a block was widened, a city engineering note about sewer realignment. The romantic imagination wants one revelation. Historical reality more often offers partial illumination, enough to identify a use, but not the entire lifespan, enough to confirm a connection, but not why it later disappeared from memory, enough to show that the story people told was wrong in detail, but perhaps still right in sensing that something important once moved beneath their feet. That may be the first real break in certainty this subject offers. The deeper one goes, the less useful the simple categories become. A tunnel is not always a tunnel in the dramatic sense people expect. A rumor is not always false simply because it is embellished. A documented space is not always fully understood simply because a plan survives. And a city does not always know itself as well as it assumes. The ground below ordinary streets keeps older logics intact long after the surface has replaced them with newer ones. So, when historians speak carefully about these underground spaces, what they are really confronting is not just buried brick and stone. They are confronting the fact that America, like many places built in haste and remade repeatedly, stores a surprising amount of its truth out of sight. Beneath the surface lie practical roots turned puzzling, workspaces turned legends, foundations of vanished buildings, and traces of systems that once made perfect sense to the people using them every day. And once that becomes clear, another question begins to rise with it. If so many of these passages were built for ordinary reasons, then why did so many later become obscure, misremembered, inaccessible, or strangely hard to explain at all? The answer begins with the way the country itself grew through weather, trade, fear, expansion, industry, and constant reinvention, and with the simple fact that going underground was, for a long time, not unusual in American life. It was practical, it was profitable, it was sometimes necessary. And that older practicality is where the mystery becomes much larger than one forgotten corridor beneath one quiet street. If the underground world beneath American streets can feel mysterious now, that is partly because modern life no longer depends on it in the same visible way. We live in a culture of surfaces. Deliveries arrive above ground. Heat comes through systems we do not usually see. Food storage is industrialized and distant. Laundry moves through machines, loading docks, and service entrances that most people never think about. But in earlier centuries, and especially in the long stretch between the colonial era and the early 20th century, much of daily life depended on hidden movement, protected storage, and practical routes that made more sense below ground than above it. That is the second truth beneath these tunnel stories. America did not go underground because it was secretive by nature. Very often, it went underground because the underground solved problems. A cellar is one of the oldest answers to that kind of problem. Before people imagine dramatic passageways stretching under entire cities, it helps to begin with something smaller and older. A cellar cools what the air above cannot. It protects food from heat. It gives households and businesses a place to store root vegetables, meat, barrels, tools, and supplies. It stabilizes temperature. It keeps certain goods out of direct light. It offers shelter during storms. In rough climates and uncertain economies, a below-ground room is not strange at all. It is sensible. Expand that logic from a single house to a block of warehouses, inns, breweries, churches, shops, government buildings, boarding houses, hospitals, mills, depots, and factories. And the ground beneath the town begins to fill with purpose. In the older parts of the United States, this happened gradually, almost quietly. A colonial settlement might begin with modest structures and modest storage. Then commerce grows. Ships arrive more regularly. Trade routes stabilize. A merchant needs a better cellar. A tavern wants cooler space for drink and provisions. A church stores fuel and supplies beneath the main floor. A growing town develops enough density that separate underground spaces begin to sit side by side. Some remain isolated. Some become linked by convenience. A wall is opened. A short passage is dug or built. A hatchway is enlarged. A set of steps is repositioned to match a new street grade. Nothing in this process requires a grand hidden plan. It is simply what happens when practical people modify space over time. Climate mattered too. In parts of the Northeast and Upper Midwest, winter made exposed movement slow, miserable, and sometimes risky. Coal needed to be moved. Food and goods needed to be delivered. Institutions such as hospitals, schools, hotels, and larger commercial blocks benefited from protected service routes. A town or city with brutal winters did not need romance to justify underground connections. It needed efficiency. Even where there were no formal tunnels in the later dramatic sense, there were often linked basements, covered passages, service corridors, and utility channels that helped buildings function as connected systems rather than isolated boxes. The same was true for heat itself. Once steam power and central heating systems spread more widely, underground conduits became part of urban logic. Pipes had to go somewhere. Boilers, furnaces, and later utility systems required access routes. In institutional settings, a university or hospital campus could gradually develop a network below ground simply because keeping heat lines, service access, and maintenance paths out of the weather made sense. To later eyes, especially when parts of that network are abandoned, the result can look almost ceremonial. Long brick corridors, arched ceilings, pipes running into dim distance, doors opening onto chambers whose original function is no longer obvious. But for the people who built them, the arrangement was less mysterious than mechanical. Warmth had to travel somehow. River cities developed their own underground complications. In towns built near active waterfronts, the relationship between the street and the basement was never fixed for long. Streets were raised to deal with flooding, drainage, mud, or changing patterns of commerce. Sidewalks shifted, retaining walls appeared. What had once been a ground-level entrance could become a basement opening after the grade changed. Old lower stories remained in use for storage, loading, or service work. Newer storefronts sat above earlier layers. Over time, some of these buried levels felt like tunnels, not because they had originally been designed as mysterious passageways, but because the city around them had physically risen. A person walking through such a space, generations later, is moving through a former street-edge world compressed below the present one. In industrial America, going underground was even easier to explain. Factories, mills, breweries, packing houses, rail facilities, and warehouses all depended on movement, temperature control, drainage, fuel, and waste management. Not every underground corridor in such places was a tunnel in the popular sense, but many were substantial enough to create that impression later, a passage moving materials between production areas, a route for steam lines or cooling systems, a chamber below a brewery holding lower temperatures, a corridor linking structures split by a lane or yard, an access run beneath a street connecting an industrial site to storage or transport infrastructure on the other side. The underground was not dramatic. It was just useful, and usefulness is one of the strongest builders in history. There were also reasons of security and order. Goods were expensive, weather destroyed things, theft was constant enough to matter. Public streets were muddy, crowded, and not always safe for valuable or perishable cargo. A merchant district operating before dawn might prefer some forms of movement out of sight, simply because it reduced delay and mess. A hotel did not necessarily want coal, dirty linen, kitchen supplies, and service traffic crossing the same polished public spaces its guests used. A hospital had similar concerns, though with greater urgency. A brewery or butcher had still others. Underground or partly buried service routes allowed the visible face of a building to stay orderly, while the less graceful labor of keeping it alive happened below. This difference between public appearance and hidden function became an important part of the American-built environment. We often remember buildings for what they projected. A courthouse projected authority. A hotel projected comfort. A church projected dignity. A theater projected glamour. But beneath many such places lay the machinery of ordinary necessity: fuel bins, storage vaults, laundry systems, boiler rooms, service passages. Sometimes those spaces connected to nearby structures for reasons that were entirely straightforward at the time. Later generations, no longer accustomed to thinking of buildings as living organisms with hidden circulatory systems, looked at the remnants and saw secrecy where there had once been routine. That still does not explain all tunnels, of course, because practical needs were not the only reason Americans built underground. War shaped some of these spaces too. Military tunnels, defensive routes, magazines, escape paths, protected storage areas, and later civil infrastructure with strategic value all formed part of the country's underground history. In forts and defensive works, going below ground reduced exposure and improved survival. Ammunition storage needed stable conditions. Troops needed protected movement. In conflict zones, or in places once designed with conflict in mind, tunnels could be deliberate responses to danger. These are among the easiest underground spaces to explain in principle, but not always in detail. Fortifications change, earthworks shift, access points collapse. Later rebuilding obscures original layouts. Oral memory simplifies what was once much more complex. A tunnel associated with defense may later gather stories of escape, concealment, or covert use that move well beyond what the surviving evidence can prove. Mining districts created another category entirely. In some parts of America, the ground was open not for passage beneath a city, but for ore, coal, salt, clay, or stone. Yet once a town grows around extraction, the line between industrial void and local legend begins to blur. Abandoned mine entries, service drifts, adits, ventilation routes, and associated chambers can become part of town memory. People know there are openings somewhere. They hear of collapsed routes beneath fields, houses, or roads. They inherit half-true stories about underground extent. A mine tunnel is not a civic tunnel, but in memory the categories can merge. The result is a local underground geography that feels far larger and stranger than the visible settlement above it. Then there were the routes shaped by commerce at the edge of legality, or beyond it. Smuggling is one of the most persistent explanations attached to old tunnels, and not always without reason. In port towns, river towns, border zones, and busy commercial districts, hidden or protected movement could be valuable. That does not mean every old passage carried contraband. Most did not. But some spaces genuinely lent themselves to discreet transport or storage. A short passage between cellar and waterfront, a concealed room attached to a warehouse, a basement route that avoided the street. A chamber used for goods that were taxed, regulated, stolen, or otherwise better handled without too much public attention. Once such a possibility enters local memory, it tends to cling to any surviving underground space, whether the association is solid, weak, or purely imagined. Prohibition later poured more fuel on that tendency. Americans love a tunnel story with vice in it because it turns masonry into drama. A narrow corridor becomes an escape route. A storage room becomes a speakeasy annex. A service passage becomes a bootlegging artery. Sometimes there is evidence for part of the tale, sometimes only for the existence of the space itself. But even when the most colorful details are doubtful, the reason such stories took hold is understandable. Buildings did have hidden sides. Public morality and private behavior did diverge. Cellars, basements, and tucked-away routes really were useful for activities people preferred not to advertise. Historical truth and historical appetite met each other there, and the result was often a story more durable than documentation. Disease and sanitation played a role as well, though they are less romantic and therefore easier to forget. Growing towns had waste problems, drainage problems, water problems, dead animal problems, overcrowding problems, and recurring fears about air, contagion, rot, and contamination. Some underground works were built not to conceal people or goods, but to carry off what the surface could not tolerate. Drains expanded, culverts widened, utility trenches became more elaborate. Access passages were added for repair. Sewers themselves, especially in older cities, sometimes later entered popular imagination as tunnels with unclear origins. People encountering old brick drainage corridors could interpret them through whatever local stories already existed. Infrastructure built for sanitation could, over enough time, detach from its own explanation and re-enter civic memory as something secretive or forgotten. Religious and civic institutions had their own reasons to use subterranean space. Churches stored supplies, archives, wine, fuel, and sometimes the dead. Government buildings safeguarded records, valuables, or sensitive materials. Banks required secure lower levels. Schools and hospitals accumulated service systems over time. In some older institutional complexes, underground movement between structures was simply a matter of continuity. A campus, monastery, hospital group, or civic cluster grows building by building, and the spaces beneath begin to reflect those relationships. Not all such connections were extensive, but enough existed to make local rumors plausible. When a town believed that a church connected to a school, or a courthouse to a jail, or a hospital wing to another building across a lane, that belief did not always arise from nothing. It might rest on an altered truth, a partial connection, or a memory of an earlier configuration now inaccessible. American expansion made record-keeping uneven, too. That matters more than it might seem. In theory, practical infrastructure should be easy to trace because practical things leave paperwork. In reality, many local systems were built in fragments. One business owner hires a mason, another adds a connection later. A contractor modifies an existing cellar without producing formal plans detailed enough to survive. A city engineer notes the presence of a corridor but not its full purpose. A fire destroys municipal records. Ownership changes hands repeatedly. Rural and frontier conditions favor improvisation over archival perfection. Temporary solutions become permanent simply by lasting. Permanent solutions are altered without much commentary. What later historians inherit is not a clean chain of intent, but scattered clues. There is a quiet irony in that. The very spaces we now find difficult to explain were often created by people being efficient, not mysterious. They built what they needed, using the materials, labor, and urgency available to them. They were not thinking about interpretation 100 years later. They were thinking about getting heat from one building to another, protecting produce, moving barrels, storing ice, keeping streets passable, reducing theft, draining water, handling coal, sheltering equipment, or making work run more smoothly in bad weather. Mystery is often what practicality becomes after context dies. And context in America died often because America changed often. A town with a strong river trade could decline after the railroad. A railroad town could weaken after highways. An industrial city could build vast systems for heat, storage, and movement, only to lose the industries that justified them. A prosperous hotel district could become offices. A brewery could become lofts. A hospital could relocate. A school could close. A block could burn and be rebuilt without entirely clearing what lay below. Each change thinned the chain of memory. By the time a later owner asks what a passage was for, nobody left nearby may know. The records, if they survive, may be in a box mislabeled in a county archive, or on a fire insurance map nobody has checked, or in a newspaper notice so ordinary at the time that no one thought it worth preserving. There is another reason underground routes became obscure. They were often not designed for the public. Public spaces leave richer historical traces because people describe them, photograph them, regulate them, celebrate them, and remember them. Service spaces do not receive the same attention. A town newspaper covers the opening of the new hotel lobby, not the corridor beneath it where laundry carts move. A civic history praises the courthouse facade, not the basement coal room or utility connection. A family preserves photographs of the storefront, not the dim passage behind it. The spaces most essential to daily function can become invisible in the record, precisely because they were not meant to be seen. That invisibility matters enormously. It means that historians studying underground spaces are often working against the grain of the archive. The evidence is there, but scattered through materials that were never gathered around a single neat story. A deed describing boundary changes, a boiler permit, a drainage note, a contractor invoice, a maintenance memory, a wall scar, a blocked arch, a change in brick bond. The public, hearing only fragments, naturally fills the gaps with larger narratives. Historians, more cautious, try to keep each fragment attached to what it can actually support. The tension between those two habits is part of what makes tunnels so compelling. One side wants meaning, the other wants proof. The tunnels stand in between, offering enough of both to keep neither side fully satisfied. It also mattered that underground spaces were often reused. A corridor built for one purpose might later serve another. A storage chamber becomes a boiler annex. A service route becomes a utility conduit. A cellar opening becomes an access point for maintenance. A sealed room becomes a rumor source. Once a space passes through several functions, each leaving marks but not always records, its original identity becomes harder to recover. A later observer may mistake the final visible use for the first one, or the first for the only one. In some cases, the question, "What was this tunnel for?" has no single answer because the tunnel belonged to multiple eras of use. Think of a 19th century passage beneath a commercial block. It might begin as a storage connection between adjacent businesses. Later, it carries fuel. Later still, it helps route pipes. Then it is partially sealed after a flood. Decades after that, one surviving segment is used for maintenance access. Another collapses. A third is rediscovered during renovation. Which of these moments defines the tunnel? The original function? The longest one? The most dramatic one? The best documented one? Historians often face that problem, not because the past is inaccessible, but because the past was busy. Spaces lived more than one life. That is why the simple phrase underground tunnel can mislead. It suggests a clear shape and a single intention. In practice, America's subterranean spaces ranged from short cellar connectors to long service corridors, from storm drains to fortified passages, from industrial conduits to buried commercial levels, from mining entries to institutional networks. Some were carefully engineered, others were improvised and later formalized. Some were legal, official, and mapped. Others sat in the hazy middle ground of tolerated convenience. A society expanding fast, rebuilding often, and valuing function over future interpretation was almost guaranteed to leave behind such spaces in large numbers. At the same time, not everything buried stayed forgotten. Many underground systems remained in use continuously, and because they remained useful, they stayed legible. Utility tunnels on active campuses, service corridors, under large institutions, transit-related passages in functioning urban systems. These are not the tunnels that usually feed mystery, because continuity of use preserves continuity of explanation. A tunnel becomes strange when that continuity breaks. Once access is limited, purpose fades, and physical traces remain without living users, the imagination gains room to work. This is where America's habit of reinvention becomes central. The country has always been especially willing to overwrite itself. Older structures are modified, demolished, adapted, or concealed with remarkable speed when economics demand it. A European city may preserve visible traces of many eras side by side. An American town often preserved them by accident below ground, while replacing them aggressively above. The result is a landscape where buried evidence sometimes survives more quietly than surface evidence. The tunnel remains because removing it costs money. The street changes because modern life demands it. What survives is not necessarily what people most valued. It is often what was easiest to leave in place. And so the practical underground accumulates. A cellar here, a service route there, a steam corridor, a culvert large enough to walk through, a retaining wall enclosing an old lower level, a passage under a street, a storage room beyond a blocked door. None of these on its own creates a grand mystery, but taken together across generations, they produce a national pattern. America kept going underground, again and again, because underground space answered recurring problems of climate, commerce, labor, sanitation, security, transport, and institutional growth. The real puzzle begins afterward. Because once those original needs disappear, the underground does not always vanish with them. It lingers in pieces. A town forgets why a wall is thicker than expected. A city knows there are old roots below, but not exactly which phase they belong to. A building owner finds an opening and inherits a story with no documents behind it. A historian uncovers records that explain half a corridor but not the sealed extension beyond. A local guide repeats a tale that is exaggerated, yet built around a genuine physical space whose first use remains uncertain. That is the point where ordinary function gives way to historical instability, and it is also the point where some tunnels become much harder to classify than others. Not because America lacked reasons to build underground, but because those reasons multiplied, overlapped, and changed faster than memory could keep up with them. The next step, then, is to move away from the broad logic of why the country went underground at all, and into the narrower, stranger category of places where the explanation no longer fits neatly on a single line. There, in the half-light between map and rumor, are the passages that keep drawing historians back. By the time a historian reaches the stranger underground spaces, one lesson has usually already settled in. The first explanation is rarely the final one. That does not mean every odd tunnel hides a lost chapter of history. More often, it means the surviving evidence is untidy. The passage exists. The masonry is real. The void beneath the building is measurable. The problem begins when people try to turn that physical fact into a complete story. A local guide says the tunnel was for smugglers. A preservationist suspects a service route. A retired contractor believes it connected to an earlier building on the block. An old newspaper hints at a basement expansion after a fire. A city map shows something beneath the street, though not clearly enough to tell whether it was a corridor, a drain, or simply a foundation line. Each clue points somewhere. None closes the case. This is where tunnel history becomes genuinely interesting, because the mystery is no longer broad and romantic. It becomes technical, local, layered, and human. One underground space may carry 3 or 4 explanations at once, each rooted in some fragment of reality. The work of the historian is not to choose the most exciting one. It is to understand why several explanations became possible in the first place. Take the common discovery pattern found in many older American downtowns. Renovation begins in a commercial block. A contractor removes modern partitioning in the basement and finds an older brick arch, partially concealed behind later concrete or drywall. The arch leads to a passage extending beyond the current footprint of the business. It may run toward the next building, or under what was once an alley, or toward the street line itself. The air inside is colder. The brickwork suggests age, but not immediate certainty. Some sections may be carefully laid, others may show later repairs. The floor may be dirt, stone, brick, or patched concrete. There may be pipe hangers, sealed niches, old metal brackets, or evidence that the space was used in more than one era. The public response to such a find is usually immediate. Someone has heard a story about tunnels under the town since childhood. Another person insists the passage once led to the river. Someone else says the old hotel used it during Prohibition. A former employee claims there were always rumors of a hidden room below the block. The local paper prints photographs. Social media gives the space a dramatic identity within hours. By evening, the passage has become the mysterious tunnel beneath downtown. But the historian arriving later sees a more difficult picture. The space may indeed be old. It may indeed connect structures in a way current building plans do not fully reflect. Yet the interpretive field around it is already crowded. Memory, civic pride, folklore, commerce, and genuine curiosity have all begun working on the same materials at once. Even careful observers can start blending the physical evidence with the most appealing available story. That is why some tunnels do not fit neatly. Not because they are beyond reason, but because the reason has to be reconstructed from fragments that were never meant to survive together. In some places, the confusion begins with the street itself. Older American towns often changed grade. Streets were raised, cut, leveled, widened, or adapted after floods, fires, sanitation reforms, or new transport needs. What a later generation experiences as a tunnel may once have been a basement entrance, a loading corridor, or a ground-adjacent service level. Over time, the city quite literally changes the meaning of the space. A brick room built beside an earlier street becomes a buried chamber. A connected row of commercial lower levels begins to feel like a hidden passage. The architecture remains the same, but the city around it reclassifies it through height, paving, and neglect. These buried levels often produce stories because they sit halfway between categories. They are too extensive to feel like ordinary basements, yet too integrated into commercial blocks to look like purpose-built secret routes. They often contain doors leading nowhere, walled-up openings, iron fittings with no obvious current purpose, and odd bends that reflect long-demolished neighboring structures. To a modern visitor, they can feel like remnants of a separate underground city. To a historian, they are usually something more precise and more elusive, the preserved lower logic of an earlier streetscape. That distinction matters, because once people start speaking of underground cities, the imagination expands faster than the evidence. Yet it is precisely the partial truth behind those phrases that keeps them alive. There really were earlier layers. There really were connected subsurface spaces. There really were forgotten roots beneath places that now look ordinary. The myth grows not from total invention, but from real physical continuity that later generations experience without the original explanatory frame. Other difficult cases involve tunnels found beneath institutions. These are often especially powerful in local memory because institutions generate narrative gravity. A church, courthouse, jail, school, hospital, or old hotel carries symbolic weight even before anything is discovered under it. So when an underground route appears nearby, interpretation tends to become moralized almost immediately. If the tunnel runs toward a church, some assume concealment, refuge, or forbidden movement. If it connects to a courthouse or jail, people imagine escape, transport, secrecy, or quiet coercion. If it lies beneath a hotel, the stories turn toward vice, hidden luxury, illicit trade, or concealed service. The tunnel becomes a story about the building above it, even when the real origin may have been much more practical. And yet historians cannot dismiss these associations entirely, because institutions did use underground spaces for important reasons. Jails needed secure movement. Courthouses stored records and sometimes linked support areas. Hospitals expanded by necessity and often created service routes between structures. Hotels required continuous, invisible labor to function. Churches and schools accumulated storage and utility systems over time. The mistake is not in assuming that the buildings had underground dimensions. The mistake is often in assuming a single dramatic use, where a series of ordinary uses is more likely. A passage beneath an institution may have begun as coal delivery. Then it may have been widened for maintenance access. Later, it may have carried pipes or lines. During a different period, it may have been partly used for discrete movement of materials or people, not because it was a secret tunnel in the dramatic sense, but because underground space is inherently useful for anything a building prefers not to stage publicly. When later generations encounter only the final visible form, they read the whole structure through its last or most interesting possibility. This happens repeatedly in underground history. A space acquires retrospective clarity that it never possessed in real time. Then, there are the tunnels, tied to vanished businesses or vanished districts. These may be the hardest to classify of all, because the surface context has been erased so completely that the remaining underground architecture seems almost orphaned. An old warehouse quarter becomes parking and mixed-use redevelopment. A manufacturing block turns into offices. A neighborhood once packed with boarding houses, storage buildings, small industry, and transport yards loses nearly all visible traces of that economy. Underneath, however, a corridor remains, or a sequence of chambers, or a narrow understreet connection linking buildings that no longer exist in recognizable form. A historian trying to understand such a tunnel has to rebuild not only the structure, but the world that required it. What moved through this district? At what hours? In what weather? Under what labor conditions? Was speed important? Concealment? Temperature control? Theft prevention? Was the underground connection between separate owners or within one integrated operation? Did the district once have a grade change now invisible from the surface? Was there a rail spur, river access point, or loading yard nearby? A tunnel without a district is like a sentence torn from a page. The grammar survives, but the meaning has gaps. This is one reason case studies vary so sharply in their degree of explainability. Some tunnels are easy to place once enough contextual material is recovered. A single insurance map, combined with a property ledger and physical inspection, can transform a mystery into a service corridor with a clear industrial purpose. Other cases remain stubborn because the district changed too thoroughly, the records are too incomplete, and the tunnel itself contains signs of modification that blur its original shape. The historian may be able to say what the space was used for in its last visible phase, but not with confidence what it first was, or how far it once extended. That partial understanding can frustrate modern audiences, who often want mystery resolved into certainty or intensified into revelation. Historical work often does neither. It narrows uncertainty. It clarifies possibilities. It ranks interpretations. It separates what can be demonstrated from what can only be suggested. In tunnel history, that careful narrowing can still leave a great deal unsettled. Some of the most compelling examples involve passages whose direction makes no immediate sense. A route heads toward a building with no obvious relationship to the one above it. A corridor terminates at a sealed wall beneath what is now a street, with no present access on the other side. A chamber sits beneath a structure built later than the masonry around it appears to be. The temptation in such cases is to leap toward hidden social uses, smuggling, secret societies, covert movement, underground refuge. Sometimes those possibilities deserve consideration. More often, the puzzle is architectural. Buildings changed, Lots merged and split, streets shifted, adjacent structures were demolished, entire property lines moved. A corridor that appears irrational now may have been perfectly rational in the urban geography of 1885 or 1910. But the fact that such puzzles often have practical roots does not make them less mysterious. It makes them mysteriously historical. The real enigma is not, what impossible secret was hidden here? But what ordinary system has vanished so completely that this surviving root now looks impossible to explain? That kind of mystery is quieter, but more durable. It does not collapse the moment one sensational theory fails. It survives because the physical evidence keeps insisting that a real, coherent world once existed around the tunnel, even if that world can no longer be fully reconstructed. There are also cases where local lore and physical evidence support each other just enough to remain permanently uncomfortable companions. A town insists that an underground passage linked a respectable public building to a district associated with vice, labor unrest, or discreet commerce. Excavation confirms there was indeed a passage, though perhaps shorter, narrower, or differently aligned than the story claims. A chamber is found in the right approximate area, but not with the features people expected. Old articles mention an underground route, but in dry language that suggests storage or utility access, while oral memory insists it was used for more colorful purposes. In such situations, history and folklore do not cancel each other out. They overlap imperfectly. That overlap is one of the most revealing features of tunnel lore in America. Underground spaces invite storytelling because they are incomplete by nature. They are hard to photograph in full, difficult to access, often closed, often unsafe, often altered, usually under private property, and almost always detached from the normal visual order of civic life. They come to the public as fragments, a sealed door, a discovered chamber, a short reopened stretch, a map line, a remembered warning from childhood not to go near a particular basement wall. Fragments are ideal conditions for narrative growth. The mind wants continuity. If the space itself no longer provides it, memory will. Yet even memory has patterns. Across the country, similar stories attach themselves to very different tunnels. This suggests not that they are all false, but that Americans repeatedly used underground space in ways the public did not fully see, and later generations repeatedly tried to explain that invisibility through the moral and emotional categories most available to them: smuggling, escape, hidden wealth, vice, refuge, danger, illicit movement. Sometimes the story points to a real use. Sometimes it simply reveals what a community believed might plausibly have happened beneath its respectable surface. The historian has to listen to both the literal claim and the social need inside it. Consider a tunnel beneath an older commercial district said to have been used by bootleggers. Even if the specific prohibition story cannot be proven, the tunnel may still reflect the same underlying truth that made the legend stick. The block may indeed have supported hidden movement. The buildings may indeed have possessed rear or below-ground systems designed to separate public and service functions. The district may indeed have contained bars, hotels, restaurants, or storage spaces that benefited from discretion. In that sense, the legend may be wrong in detail, but accurate in atmosphere. It recognizes that the architecture allowed for forms of action not visible from the street. Similarly, a passage rumored to have served as an escape route from a jail or courthouse may in reality have supported controlled movement, storage, heating, or maintenance. But the rumor persists because the building type itself invites thoughts about custody, secrecy, and unseen transit. The tunnel becomes a dramatic translation of a quieter institutional truth, that public buildings have backstage systems, and that those systems are often forgotten more easily than the ceremonies above them. This is why certain tunnels remain historically unstable long after their existence is no longer in doubt. Their mystery does not depend on whether the bricks are real, It depends on interpretive overpressure, too many possible functions, too much loss of context, too much story attached too early, too much alteration across generations. Once these forces accumulate, the tunnel becomes less like a solved object and more like a contested sentence, with every observer emphasizing a different clause. Physical modification makes the problem worse. Underground spaces are rarely preserved in their original state. They flood, they crack, they are patched, openings are sealed for safety. New conduits are threaded through old corridors, floors are raised, ceilings are reinforced, debris fills low sections. Owners simplify strange spaces by walling them off. Municipal crews cut through earlier structures without fully documenting them. Fire damage can transform brick surfaces in ways later observers misread as evidence of age or clandestine use. By the time a passage is re-examined, the space itself may contain material clues from 4 or 5 different periods, layered so tightly that even specialists disagree about sequence. A narrow brick tunnel, for example, may look older than it is because its visible surface belongs to an early repair, while its original opening has been lost. A chamber may seem unrelated to the building above it until property records reveal that an earlier structure once extended farther back. A supposed secret route may turn out to be a utility run, but one later adapted for storage in a period that generated the local rumor. A passage believed to cross beneath a street may once have done so only after a later extension. Every physical alteration adds another interpretive fork. This does not mean tunnel history is hopelessly uncertain. Many cases can be explained to a useful degree. But the ones that continue to attract attention usually survive in exactly that zone where explanation is possible, yet incomplete. Enough evidence exists to rule out fantasy. Not enough exists to finish the story cleanly. And perhaps that is why these tunnels hold their power. They are not blank mysteries. Blank mysteries tend to fade. What lasts is partial intelligibility. A tunnel that clearly meant something, clearly served someone, clearly belonged to a now fragmented system, a real passage with a missing world around it. An underground route that tells us, in brick and shadow, that our knowledge of the places we inhabit is often thinner than we imagine. When historians return to these sites, again and again, it is not because they expect a dramatic final reveal under every town. It is because each site offers a test of historical method. What can be known from masonry, records, urban change, and local memory together? Where do the materials agree? Where do they separate? When does a story preserve truth, and when does it simply preserve desire? How much of a place can disappear above ground before the space below becomes almost impossible to read? By this point, another realization begins to form. The tunnels that do not fit neatly are not only difficult because of architecture, they are difficult because people themselves leave uneven traces. Work gets forgotten. Shame gets softened. Illicit trade becomes anecdote. Institutional routine becomes rumor. Communities preserve the dramatic and let the practical slip away. The underground keeps the physical imprint, but the human record surrounding it is often thinner, messier, and more selective than the brickwork suggests. And once that becomes clear, the mystery deepens in a different direction. The next layer is no longer only about passages and chambers. It is about the lives that moved through them, the kinds of labor and fear and discretion they made possible, and the reasons some histories sink out of sight more easily than others. Beneath the tunnels themselves waits a more human underground, one shaped as much by silence and memory as by stone. Once underground spaces are separated from the buildings and blocks that first made them useful, they begin attracting human stories almost immediately. Not abstract stories, but very specific ones. Someone used this tunnel to move whiskey. Someone hid down here during a riot. Someone escaped through that corridor before dawn. Workers crossed below the street in winter so the public would not see the labor that kept the district alive. A church concealed frightened people beneath its foundations. A jail moved prisoners through a passage no one above ground noticed. A hotel sent linen, coal, food, bottles, and servants through darkness while guests admired the polished lobby upstairs. The same few themes appear over and over again in different towns, around different kinds of structures, often attached to spaces that are only partly understood. That repetition is revealing. It tells us that underground places are not remembered only as architecture. They are remembered as social pressure made physical. When people imagine what happened below ground, they tend to imagine whatever a community once wanted hidden, protected, controlled, or kept moving without public interruption. The tunnel becomes a stage for the parts of history that feel least comfortable in daylight: smuggling, labor, confinement, fear, disease, class separation, vice, emergency, shelter, and escape. Sometimes that memory is exaggerated. Sometimes it is wrong in detail, but it is rarely random. Even the most colorful tunnel legends usually gather around real human conditions that once made below-ground movement attractive. Take labor first, because labor is one of the most under-remembered explanations in American tunnel history. Most cities prefer to remember their facades rather than their service systems. The Grand Hotel, not the coal dust. The department store, not the stock movement beneath it. The hospital tower, not the hot pipes and laundry carts. The railway depot, not the grimy maintenance route. Yet the hidden world below many institutions and commercial blocks often existed precisely so labor could remain efficient without becoming visible. There is something quietly powerful in that arrangement. A building above ground presents order, dignity, comfort, or authority. Beneath it, workers carry fuel, food, linens, tools, records, waste, machinery parts, and all the other materials that allow the performance above to continue. In bad weather, this mattered even more. Snow, ice, rain, mud, and heat could all disrupt visible movement. A service corridor or buried passage reduced delay and reduced exposure. It also preserved hierarchy. Guests did not need to see laundry. Patients did not need to see waste removal. Shoppers did not need to watch stock hauled through the front doors. The tunnel, or tunnel-like service route, made public life smoother by keeping essential labor out of view. That hiddenness has historical consequences. When a community later rediscovers a passage and asks what it was for, labor is often the least glamorous answer available, and therefore one of the easiest to overlook. A smuggling legend will spread faster than a story about coal delivery. An escape narrative is more exciting than a subterranean laundry route. A town may happily preserve folklore about a secret whiskey corridor while forgetting the workers who carried heat, provisions, and supplies through the same or a similar passage for decades. The physical space survives. The daily labor it served becomes thin in the record because ordinary work, especially difficult work done by poor people, immigrants, hired staff, prisoners, servants, or maintenance crews, is less likely to have been narrated with pride. That pattern appears across much of American urban history. Public memory favors what a place wanted to say about itself. Underground memory often preserves what the place needed, but preferred not to emphasize. In some cases, this selective memory blends with class. The more elegant the world above, the more likely the world below was designed to be invisible. A fine hotel does not stop being a machine because it has chandeliers. A courthouse is not only ideals in stone. A hospital is not only care. All are systems of work, and systems of work produce routes for movement. Hidden corridors can therefore reflect class distinction without any dramatic secrecy being involved at all. The people who used the tunnel may have been employees whose movement was expected to remain efficient and discreet. Later generations, no longer seeing those social arrangements clearly, interpret the space through more theatrical categories. This is one reason some tunnel stories feel morally charged even when the evidence is incomplete. The architecture seems to confirm that there was, literally, another level of social reality beneath the official one. Now add smuggling, illicit trade, or discreet commerce to that environment, and the symbolism grows stronger. Not every underground passage carried contraband. Most almost certainly did not. But some spaces genuinely lent themselves to forms of movement that benefited from privacy. In port towns, warehouse districts, riverfront blocks, and commercial streets crowded with storage, saloons, hotels, taverns, and freight handling, below-ground routes could be useful in practical and quasi-legal ways. A short connector between cellars, a storage room with a secondary opening, a passage beneath a street or alley, a basement route to a loading edge, even a concealed or little-noticed chamber beneath a business, all could feed later stories because each offered the right physical conditions for discretion. American memory loves to attach these spaces to alcohol, and not without reason. Before and during Prohibition, drink was woven deeply into daily life, regulation, and evasion. Many communities developed elaborate local stories about hidden bars, concealed bottle storage, quick disposal chutes, basement rooms, bricked side spaces, and routes for moving supplies without attracting attention. Some of those stories sit on firm evidence, others sit on almost none. But even where the legend exceeds the proof, the attraction is understandable. Underground space naturally lends itself to the idea of unofficial commerce because it already exists outside normal visibility. There is also a subtler truth here. A town that says, "This tunnel was used for bootlegging," may not be preserving an exact historical fact. It may be preserving a local memory that the block as a whole had an underground life, one partly removed from polite supervision. That life might have included storage, service, side deals, short-term concealment, after-hours movement, or relationships between neighboring businesses not fully reflected in formal documents. The tunnel legend condenses all of that into one memorable theme. Smuggling legends attached to waterfronts operate in a similar way. The closer a tunnel lies to a river, harbor, dock district, or commercial edge, the easier it becomes to imagine hidden cargo moving through it. Sometimes, such stories are plausible in a narrow sense. A cellar near a waterfront might indeed have been convenient for discreet storage or transfer, but the image tends to expand over time. A short practical route becomes an extensive clandestine system in popular memory. What matters for the historian is not dismissing the story too quickly, but asking why that particular story attached itself so firmly to that particular space. Usually the answer lies in a mix of real physical suitability, known local commerce, incomplete records, and a community's sense that the visible economy was never the whole economy. Fear shapes other tunnel stories even more strongly than vice does. In periods of unrest, disease, violence, or perceived threat, underground spaces acquire protective meanings very quickly. People imagine refuge below ground because below ground feels enclosed, defensible, and removed. A cellar shelters from storm, but also from panic. A passage allows movement without exposure. A chamber beneath a large structure feels, even now, like the kind of place one might retreat to when something outside has become dangerous or unstable. That makes refuge one of the most persistent and difficult themes in tunnel history. It overlaps with many kinds of American experience: war, riot, anti-immigrant violence, racial terror, urban fire, epidemics, political upheaval, industrial conflict, even household fear. Communities under stress often produce real hiding places, temporary shelters, and semi-concealed routes. The problem is that these uses are not always well documented, especially when they were improvised, unofficial, or associated with vulnerable people who left fewer written records behind. This is where the historian must become especially careful. It is tempting to turn every underground rumor into a dramatic sanctuary narrative. Sometimes evidence does support hidden protection or discreet movement of endangered people. At other times, the story rests more on later moral imagination than on recoverable fact. But there are good reasons such stories survive. America has repeatedly produced conditions in which being unseen mattered. Labor organizers, fugitive individuals, people facing racial persecution, people avoiding mobs, families during urban disorder, or communities navigating emergency all had reasons to value hidden or protected spaces, even when those spaces were not purpose-built for that role. A passage or chamber might therefore have one original function and a later emergency one. A coal cellar becomes a temporary shelter during unrest. A service route becomes a discrete movement path during disease control or public disorder. A storage chamber beneath a church or institutional building becomes a place of refuge not because it was designed as one, but because it was available, hidden, and structurally useful when needed. Later generations may remember only the more dramatic use, or may merge several episodes into one simplified narrative. Again, the underground invites layered truth rather than single-function certainty. Racial history complicates these stories even further. Some of the most sensitive tunnel legends in America involve claims about concealment, forced movement, segregation, escape, or hidden refuge attached to communities whose documentary record was shaped by exclusion and power imbalance. Historians must handle such claims with enormous care, because both careless skepticism and careless affirmation can do damage. On one side lies the temptation to romanticize thin evidence. On the other lies the temptation to dismiss local memory merely because it survives in oral form or because the physical structure can also be explained pragmatically. The truth is that official records often preserve dominant institutions better than vulnerable lives. A town may have paperwork for a courthouse boiler, but none for the frightened people who temporarily hid below a nearby building during violence. A business may document basement renovations without mentioning the labor discipline, coercion, or racial ordering that shaped who moved through those spaces and under what conditions. A tunnel beneath an old district may therefore be socially charged, not because the bricks themselves reveal everything, but because the human reality around those bricks was only partially written down. This is why some communities guard tunnel stories with such intensity. The passage becomes more than an architectural puzzle. It becomes a vessel for memory that feels otherwise erased. The historian's task is not to flatten that feeling into either credulity or contempt. It is to understand that underground spaces can hold unresolved moral weight because so much of the record above ground was selective from the start. Prisons and jails generate another category of charged interpretation. Wherever custody exists, stories of hidden routes flourish. Sometimes people imagine escape tunnels. Sometimes they imagine controlled underground transfer. Sometimes they suspect more ominous movement hidden from the public eye. Not all such claims can be proven, of course. Many jails had no dramatic tunnel at all, only yards, secure doors, and basement utility spaces. Yet some carceral sites did develop below-ground connections or associated chambers for very practical reasons: moving fuel, accessing service areas, linking structures, or controlling circulation in ways that minimized risk and visibility. Once a place is associated with confinement, even an ordinary sublevel becomes narratively unstable. The public naturally asks, who passed through here, and under what terms? That question is not trivial. Carceral institutions often involved layers of routine that communities later preferred not to remember too clearly: transport of prisoners, holding areas, work details, segregated movement, off-record or poorly remembered practices of control. An underground route beneath or near such a site can therefore feel unsettling because it suggests a hidden choreography of power. Sometimes, the tunnel story exaggerates, but the unease it taps into is real. A community understands instinctively that institutions of punishment rarely revealed their full internal logic to public view. Hospitals do something similar, though in a different emotional register. A hospital tunnel may be immediately explainable as a service corridor or utility route, but it still tends to gather eerie narratives because hospitals combine care, bodily vulnerability, death, and backstage labor in unusually intense ways. People know there were routes below for steam lines, supplies, laundry, food, maintenance, and interbuilding movement. Yet they also sense that sickness, secrecy, quarantine, and quiet transport were part of institutional life. In times of epidemic especially, below-ground service spaces can seem to carry a pressure larger than their engineering purpose. They become associated with what a city endured but did not necessarily narrate in public terms. Disease itself, in fact, has probably shaped more underground memory than most people realize. During outbreaks, communities reorganize movement rapidly. Waste removal, isolation, supply handling, burial logistics, sanitation, and institutional discipline all intensify. A cellar, corridor, service route, or hidden chamber might take on temporary functions never fully documented later because they belong to crisis management rather than permanent design. The physical structure remains. The emergency use fades. The next generation inherits a space that seems overly suggestive for its official explanation. Fear also accumulates through children's memory. Many American tunnel stories survive first, not in archives but in warnings. Do not go near that basement wall. Do not enter the old passage under the building. There is a room down there that was sealed for a reason. A parent or grandparent may not know the full truth, yet the warning itself carries social meaning. It tells us the space had a reputation dangerous, illicit, eerie, unstable, or morally charged. These childhood fragments often become the emotional foundation of adult lore. A historian hearing them years later is not receiving factual proof, but something valuable all the same, evidence that the underground had entered local feeling. The same is true of workers' stories. Maintenance crews, janitors, demolition teams, furnace operators, utility hands, warehouse staff, and long-time building employees often hold the richest informal knowledge about underground spaces because their jobs actually brought them into contact with them. But this knowledge is fragile. It is often oral, localized, and tied to people whose work itself was historically undervalued. A city may produce glossy centennial histories and still lose the only living memory of what a certain basement passage was for when a retired boiler technician dies. That asymmetry matters. It means that some of the best explanations for mysterious tunnels were once available, but not preserved through channels historians later inherit easily. This is one of the saddest and most fascinating aspects of the subject. The passage survives in brick, but the knowledge of the people who used it vanishes because their labor was never thought worthy of careful record. Once those human traces thin out, the tunnel is left exposed to reinterpretation. A former laundry route can become a rumored escape corridor. A coal passage can become a smuggling tunnel. A maintenance void can become evidence of a hidden society. Sometimes these reinterpretations are clearly false, but sometimes they are not complete distortions. They are attempts to restore emotional meaning to a space whose practical meaning has been lost. A community senses that the tunnel mattered, and so it assigns a kind of significance the present can still feel. Underground spaces are especially vulnerable to that shift because they naturally divide the visible and the invisible. Above ground, buildings participate in civic identity. Below ground, they participate in necessity, control, risk, and adaptation. The more a society idealizes its visible face, the more charged the invisible level becomes in retrospect. That is why tunnels beneath elegant districts and civic centers often attract the most durable legends. They seem to confirm that another version of the same place existed, one sustained by hidden work, private arrangements, emergency behavior, or morally ambiguous movement. In this sense, tunnels are not only structural remnants, they are memory traps. They collect what a community does not know how to narrate cleanly. Labor without honor. Vice without admission. Refuge without full proof. Fear without a neat beginning or end. Institutions whose official purpose was never their only reality. Social hierarchies built into movement itself. Below-ground architecture turns all of that into something tangible. A doorway, a corridor, a chamber, a blocked arch. The physicality gives the story weight, even when the story itself has changed shape over time. And yet, for all this interpretive richness, one stubborn problem remains. Feeling is not proof. Atmosphere is not evidence. Moral plausibility is not chronological certainty. A tunnel may invite exactly the right human story and still resist confirmation in all the details that matter most. Was that route truly used for contraband, or only convenient enough for later people to assume it was? Did people genuinely shelter here during unrest, or did the town later assign the space that role because it seemed fitting? Was an institution hiding something below, or merely operating as institutions always do, with hidden service systems the public rarely sees? How much of the fear attached to a passage came from history, and how much from the unnerving fact that most people simply do not like sealed spaces beneath familiar ground? These questions bring us very close to the heart of why historians still struggle with some underground sites. The difficulty is not only that records are missing, it is that human meaning adheres to these places faster than evidence can sort itself out. The tunnel is there. The need for explanation is immediate. The local memory is strong, but the chain tying one to the other is often broken in several places at once. That broken chain becomes even harder to repair because underground spaces are among the worst historical environments for clean proof. They are modified, reused, flooded, sealed, repaired, reopened, and partially collapsed. Later interventions mix with earlier ones. Maps simplify. Oral testimony compresses. Property access limits investigation. Newspaper reports dramatize. Engineering notes under-explain. Archaeology below active towns is expensive, partial, and often impossible to pursue as deeply as the mystery would require. In other words, the human pressure around these tunnels is intense, precisely where the material conditions for certainty are weakest. So, by the time we reach this point in the story, the picture has changed again. The tunnels are no longer only architectural puzzles or carriers of rumor. They are sites where labor, discretion, class, fear, refuge, punishment, illness, and community memory all converge. They tell us that what a town remembers publicly is not necessarily what it lived most deeply. They also tell us that the past does not disappear evenly. Some histories remain on plaques and facades. Others sink into sublevels, service routes, sealed rooms, and whispered explanations passed between people who once worked in the dark. And that leads to the next and perhaps hardest question of all. If these tunnels gathered so many functions, so many retellings, and so many layers of modification, how can historians ever hope to separate original purpose from later use, physical fact from inherited atmosphere, and true uncertainty from the simple damage caused by time? The answer lies not only in the tunnels, but in the limits of the evidence itself, limits that have kept some of America's buried passages suspended between explanation and mystery for far longer than most people expect. By the time a tunnel becomes a public mystery, it has usually already passed through several kinds of damage. Some damage is physical. Brick collapses, water enters, timber rots, floors sink, openings are sealed, new walls are built through old ones. Pipes, cables, drains, and conduits are threaded through whatever space remains usable. Rubble is pushed into low sections because clearing it costs time and money. A property owner narrows an entrance for safety. A city fills part of a corridor during a street project. Fire alters surfaces. Moisture blurs mortar lines. Rust consumes hardware. The tunnel survives, but not as a clean historical artifact. It survives as a wounded environment, carrying traces of multiple moments without announcing their order. Other damage is documentary. Plans go missing. Records are split across offices. A contractor describes a basement alteration without naming the earlier structure it cut through. An insurance map simplifies. A newspaper mentions subcellar improvements in one short line and never returns to the subject. A deed records a property transfer but says almost nothing about the buried spaces attached to it. A maintenance log survives only in fragments. A local archive stores relevant photographs under a heading no researcher would think to search. The historian does not confront one broken chain of evidence, but several. And then there is interpretive damage, which may be the hardest kind of all. Once a tunnel gains a dramatic reputation, later observations tend to arrive already shaped by expectation. Every arch looks older. Every side opening looks concealed. Every unexplained bend feels intentional in a dramatic sense. A bricked wall becomes proof of secrecy before anyone asks whether it might simply reflect flood control, structural reinforcement, or lot line change. Local memory can preserve important clues, but it can also press a structure into a story so firmly that alternative readings become socially unwelcome. This is why the evidence around underground spaces so often refuses to settle into a final answer. It is not that historians have never looked. In many cases, they have looked carefully. Engineers have inspected. Preservationists have mapped. Archaeologists have sampled. Archivists have traced property histories. Journalists have revisited old claims. Local historians have compared oral accounts with city records and surviving construction details. The problem is not lack of attention alone. The problem is that the surviving evidence itself is structurally incomplete. To understand how that happens, it helps to think about what historians usually rely on when reconstructing a place. They want layered agreement, physical evidence, written records, maps, photographs, context from neighboring structures, known timelines of ownership and construction. If these line up, a confident interpretation becomes possible. A corridor exists physically, appears on a map from 1892, is referenced in a boiler installation permit from 1891, and connects buildings known to have shared ownership at that time. That is good historical alignment. It does not make every detail certain, but it produces a strong explanation. Tunnel mysteries persist where that alignment breaks down. Perhaps the corridor exists physically but does not appear clearly on surviving maps, or a map does show something below ground, but the notation is too vague to distinguish a utility chase from a walkable passage. Perhaps a newspaper article mentions a tunnel beneath a block, but written in the loose language of the day, where tunnel, subway, passage, vault, and subcellar are used imprecisely. Perhaps the buildings now connected by an underground route were not owned together when the visible masonry seems to suggest they should have been. Perhaps the route itself was altered so heavily that what survives belongs to a later phase than the records people are using to explain it. When these mismatches accumulate, history does not stop. It becomes probabilistic. That word can be disappointing to people who come to tunnel stories hoping for either revelation or debunking, but probabilistic reasoning is often the most honest form of explanation available. Historians begin asking narrower questions. Which portions of the structure appear original and which appear repaired? Which functions are most consistent with the district at the time? Which stories arose earliest in the documentary record, and which appear only much later? Do oral accounts converge independently, or repeat one widely circulated local version? Are there parallel examples in similar towns that would make a particular use more plausible? Which features of the tunnel reflect engineering necessity, and which suggest discretionary or unusual design? This kind of narrowing can be remarkably effective, but it rarely produces a perfect ending. Instead, it produces a hierarchy of possibilities. One explanation becomes strongest. Another remains plausible but weaker. A third belongs mostly to folklore. Yet even after careful work, the best conclusion may still include a frustrating phrase, "Not enough evidence survives," to determine the original purpose with confidence. That phrase appears so often in buried history because underground spaces are unusually hostile to clean chronology. A room above ground can often be dated through visible style, documented renovation, photographs, and continuous use. A room below ground, especially one closed off for decades, may preserve layers from many different periods with little visual guidance about sequence. A wall may be 19th century, but the arch cut through it may be early 20th. The floor surface may be mid-century, patching over an earlier drain line. Pipe brackets may indicate one phase of use, while soot on the ceiling reflects another. If the historian cannot excavate fully, dismantle safely, or access adjoining sections under neighboring properties, even good physical reading has limits. Water makes this worse. Water is one of the great enemies of subterranean certainty. Groundwater seeps, floods deposit silt, repeated damp weakens mortar, metal components corrode away. Organic materials, wooden doors, shelving, carts, labels, fabric, paper, rope, disappear far faster than the masonry around them. Yet those organic materials are often what would have clarified use most clearly. A surviving brick corridor without its doors, bins, containers, signage, and movable equipment becomes much harder to read. A storage route and a service route may look similar once everything portable is gone. A chamber once used for cooling may resemble one used for shelter after enough generations of alteration and damp. Water does not only destroy evidence, it strips context first. Collapse is similarly cruel to interpretation. If a tunnel survives in full, its direction, width, grade, ventilation, access points, and relationship to adjacent structures may all help explain its purpose. But many tunnels do not survive in full. They survive as segments, an entry here, a chamber there, a stretch of corridor ending in debris, a side branch, now inaccessible, a filled section beneath a street. Historians must reconstruct a system from broken geometry, and broken geometry is dangerous ground for certainty. The public imagines what lies beyond the rubble. Historians, more cautiously, can only ask what the surviving alignment makes likely. This is one reason maps are both essential and misleading. People often assume that once an old map is found, the mystery is close to solved. But maps are not neutral mirrors. They are tools made for particular purposes. A fire insurance map, for example, may show building footprints, construction materials, business uses, and some basement details, but not necessarily the full complexity of underground connections. A city utility map may care deeply about pipes and drains while ignoring commercial passages. A property plat may register boundaries without saying much about subgrade architecture. A military map may simplify civilian structures. A tourist guide may exaggerate. A newspaper illustration may be nearly useless as a technical source, even while preserving local assumptions worth noting. Worse still, different maps can reflect different moments in the life of the same space. A corridor present in 1888 may be sealed by 1903, or extended by 1920, or no longer labeled because its new use fell outside the mapmaker's concerns. Historians comparing maps, therefore, have to ask not only what is shown, but why that particular document would have chosen to show or ignore a feature at all. The same caution applies to language. When a surviving article says there was an underground passage, what does that mean in the local vocabulary of the time? Was it a walkable corridor? A narrow service opening? A utility trench large enough for maintenance access? A basement opening under a sidewalk? American historical sources are full of terms that sound definitive to modern ears, but were often used loosely. A tunnel might be little more than a passage between cellar rooms. A vault may refer to storage rather than a bank-style chamber. A subway in the 19th century may not mean what a modern reader expects. Many tunnel mysteries expand because later audiences read old terminology with too much confidence. Photographs can help, but only when they exist and only when they are interpreted carefully. A rediscovered tunnel often enters the record through striking modern images: brick arch, darkness beyond, flashlight beam, rubble underfoot. These pictures are emotionally powerful, but they are already late. They show the space after decades of alteration, closure, or damage. Older photographs, if they survive, may depict only the buildings above, or a renovation moment that catches part of an opening by accident. Historians learn to value accidental evidence because so much underground architecture appears only at the edge of the frame: a stair descending behind a worker, a sidewalk hatch, a retaining wall, a loading basement, an entrance later buried or sealed. But accidental evidence rarely resolves every question. It sharpens some and complicates others. Then there is the problem of access. Many underground spaces lie under active property, under streets, under neighboring parcels, or beneath buildings not designed for full archaeological investigation. A historian may know that the only way to settle a disputed alignment would be to examine the adjoining section under another property, but the property owner may refuse, or the cost may be too high, or the safety risk may be unacceptable. Municipal authorities may prioritize structural stability over historical curiosity, which is understandable. Once a void threatens a street or building, filling and reinforcing often take precedence over careful interpretation. Preservation and infrastructure do not always cooperate. A city cannot leave a dangerous subsurface opening untreated because the past remains unresolved. This creates a painful paradox. The very work needed to keep modern life functioning can erase the last clues needed to explain older underground life fully. Archaeology is often invoked as the final answer to these problems. But archaeology, too, has limits, especially beneath active towns and cities. Excavation is expensive, targeted, and constrained by what can safely be opened. Archaeologists do not simply peel back a city block like a lid and read every stage in perfect sequence. They work through trenches, exposures, salvage conditions, emergency finds, narrow windows during construction, or small, accessible areas. Even when they uncover remarkable information, the results may illuminate only one segment of a larger system. A tunnel can be partially understood archaeologically and still remain unresolved as a network. Urban archaeology also deals constantly with disturbance. Few underground spaces survive untouched. Utilities cut through older layers. Demolition debris is backfilled. Foundations trench across earlier alignments. A chamber is reused as a dump. A corridor is partially robbed of brick. What looks like a puzzling void may in fact be the damaged remainder of something once easier to interpret. Archaeology can reveal sequence, but only where sequence remains legible enough to be read. Engineering analysis helps in different ways. Masonry type, arch form, load-bearing logic, ventilation, drainage, and structural relationships can all suggest function. A tunnel designed to carry people regularly may differ from one built only for service access. A route meant for coal or freight may have different proportions from one intended primarily for pipe maintenance. A chamber requiring stable temperature may show certain insulating or locational choices, but engineering evidence, too, has a frustrating habit of narrowing several possibilities rather than selecting one absolutely. A corridor may be wide enough for more than one plausible use. An opening may have been enlarged later. A structural feature may reflect not function but adaptation to difficult soil or adjoining foundations. In other words, the architecture can say a great deal, but not always the most emotionally satisfying thing. Oral testimony sits uneasily beside all of this. Historians cannot ignore it, because oral knowledge has saved many underground histories from complete disappearance. Long-time workers may know where sealed entries lie. Families may remember a tunnel's use long after paperwork is gone. Community tradition may preserve a connection that later physical inspection confirms, at least in outline. But oral history is vulnerable to drift. Stories simplify across retellings. Different episodes merge. The most vivid explanation displaces duller, but more accurate ones. A tunnel, once used for deliveries during one era and for discrete storage during another, may become, in memory, only the smuggling tunnel. The old janitor who knew which wall used to open into which chamber dies, and the next generation inherits only half the account. Memory is not worthless. It is simply uneven. Newspapers are similar. They can be wonderful and dangerously theatrical. A rediscovered passage made good copy then as now. Journalists liked odd findings, civic legends, and atmospheric descriptions. A local article might preserve the only reference to a tunnel before later redevelopment destroyed it. But newspapers also borrowed rumor freely, especially when a tunnel could be connected to vice, scandal, haunted reputation, political intrigue, or colorful local character. Historians reading such sources ask careful questions. Was the article contemporary to the tunnel's active use, or written decades later during a nostalgia wave? Did the reporter rely on named sources, public records, and direct inspection, or mostly on anecdote? Was the piece descriptive, promotional, skeptical, playful? A dramatic article may preserve valuable data hidden inside its embellishment, but extracting that data takes patience. Another obstacle is that tunnels are often reused in ways that overwrite their beginnings without erasing them completely. Imagine a corridor first built as a service passage between commercial structures. Years later, it is modified for steam lines. Later still, it is used for storage. During Prohibition, perhaps a section does in fact shelter contraband temporarily. After that, flooding leads to partial closure. Then, utilities are threaded through the accessible part. Finally, it is sealed and forgotten. What is the real identity of that tunnel? If a modern discovery finds bottles, pipe brackets, soot, and structural evidence of original through access, the answer is not singular. Any historian trying to explain it to the public has to decide whether to emphasize origin, longest use, final visible use, or most culturally resonant use. Different choices produce different stories, all partly true and partly misleading. This is why so many tunnel debates persist even among careful researchers. The disagreement is not always about whether the tunnel existed. It is about which phase of its life deserves interpretive priority. Local pride complicates matters further. A town with a rediscovered tunnel quickly realizes that mystery has value. It attracts attention, visitors, press coverage, preservation energy, and a sense of distinctiveness. There is nothing wrong with local enthusiasm, and it often saves sites that might otherwise be erased. But civic storytelling can lock a particular interpretation into place before the evidence justifies it. Once a place brands a route as the bootlegging tunnel, the escape tunnel, the underground railroad tunnel, the hidden city tunnel, or the haunted passage, alternative explanations feel like disappointments rather than progress. Historians may then find themselves in the awkward position of offering a more cautious account to a community that has already fallen in love with a stronger one. Yet the reverse problem exists too. Official institutions sometimes prefer the safer explanation. Even when the evidence points toward a socially charged past, they would rather not foreground. A tunnel is labeled merely utilitarian when the archive hints at more complicated human use. A difficult local history is smoothed into maintenance language. In such cases, skepticism must be applied in both directions. Romantic exaggeration distorts, but so can institutional tidiness. What remains, after all these pressures, is a field of explanation shaped by absence. Not empty absence, but textured absence. Missing plans, missing users, missing segments, missing records of emergency use, missing adjacent properties, missing materials destroyed by water or rot, missing social context because the labor that used the space was not recorded with care, missing clarity because later adaptations obscured original design, missing precision because the surviving vocabulary was loose, missing neutrality because local memory and local interest reached the site before method could do all its work. And still, despite all that, historians do learn things, quite a lot in fact. They can often determine whether a tunnel was purpose-built or opportunistic, whether it belongs to one construction phase or several, whether it most likely served service, storage, utility, movement, defense, drainage, or mixed use, whether the most famous legend attached to it is impossible, plausible, or unprovable, whether a route once extended farther than today, whether a buried chamber aligns with an older street grade, whether a supposed secret passage is really the remnant of a lost commercial level, whether a local tradition contains a core of truth. But the last inch of certainty is often unavailable. That final inch matters psychologically because humans are not satisfied with well-supported ambiguity. We want closure. Was it for smugglers or not? Did it connect to the jail or not? Were people hidden there or not? Was it ancient or only old? Did it run to the river or didn't it? Underground history resists these clean endings because the materials of answer have often been damaged by the very conditions that preserved the mystery in the first place. The tunnel lasted because it was hidden, ignored, buried, sealed, or only partly reused. Those same conditions made full documentation less likely to survive with it. In that sense, mystery is not an accidental decoration laid on top of these spaces. It is built into the way they endure. The underground preserves structure while stripping explanation unevenly. It lets brick remain when paper is lost. It lets a route survive when the district that justified it is gone. It lets rumor travel farther than the last maintenance note. And so historians stand before these passages with an unusual kind of humility. Not the humility of surrender, but the humility of knowing that even careful method sometimes ends at a bricked wall, a flooded segment, a changed property line, a missing ledger, a collapsed junction, or a phrase in an old article too vague to carry all the weight placed upon it. That is why the evidence still refuses to settle. Not because there are no answers. There are often many partial answers. Not because nobody has cared enough to look. Many have looked, and looked closely. Not because every tunnel is hiding some grand forbidden truth. Most are not. The difficulty is more human and more historical than that. America built underground for many reasons, altered those spaces repeatedly, forgot the people who used them, preserved the most dramatic stories more readily than the most practical ones, and then kept rebuilding the surface until the buried level lost its explanatory world. What survives is enough to prove complexity, enough to undermine easy myths, enough to sustain real wonder, and often not enough to finish the story completely. And perhaps that incompleteness is the final clue needed before the ending comes into view. The tunnels are mysterious, not simply because they are below ground, but because they reveal a larger pattern in the country above them. America does not only build, it builds over. It does not only remember, it remembers selectively. It leaves some of its most revealing systems out of sight, then forgets the language needed to describe them. Beneath the streets, the country has kept an archive in brick and shadow, fragmented, wounded, suggestive, and unfinished. To understand why that archive still resists total explanation is to begin understanding something broader about the nation itself, and about the hidden layers on which so much ordinary life has always rested. By the end of a story like this, there is a temptation to gather every tunnel, every chamber, every bricked-up arch, every cellar passage, and every half-remembered route into one grand conclusion. To say that the mystery proves something hidden and unified. To say that beneath America there lies a second nation, a secret design, a lost map waiting to be restored if only enough walls were broken open and enough records found. But buried history is rarely that neat. What lies beneath American streets is not one hidden system. It is many systems, built for different reasons, at different times, by different hands, under different pressures. Some were commercial. Some were institutional. Some were military. Some were industrial. Some were no more than practical connectors. Some became more important in memory than they had ever been in use. Some were altered so many times that the original purpose can only be guessed at. Some are well understood. Some are only partly understood. And some remain suspended in that uneasy space where the structure is real, the stories are real, the history is real, but the full chain linking them together has broken. That is why historians still return to these tunnels, and why they still hesitate. The hesitation is not weakness, it is respect. Respect for the fact that the past does not always survive in a form that allows a clean explanation. Respect for the difference between what can be demonstrated and what can only be felt. Respect for physical evidence that points strongly in one direction, while still leaving gaps large enough for uncertainty to pass through. Respect for local memory, even when local memory has changed shape over time. Respect for the lives of workers, migrants, prisoners, nurses, laborers, servants, clerks, furnace men, cellar hands, maintenance crews, and frightened families whose movements may have depended on these spaces even when official records had little reason to preserve them clearly. And perhaps most of all, respect for the fact that ordinary life produces extraordinary mystery when enough of its context is lost. That may be the quietest answer to the title's promise. The mysterious tunnels beneath America that historians still cannot explain are not always mysterious because they were designed to be secret. Very often, they are mysterious because they were designed to be useful. Then, the businesses closed. The districts changed. The street grades shifted. The public functions survived while the backstage ones disappeared. Buildings were demolished and rebuilt. Service systems were abandoned. New utilities cut through old corridors. Floods, fires, neglect, and redevelopment damaged the evidence. The people who once knew what the spaces were for died without leaving much behind. A practical route slipped out of living memory and entered legend. That is not a lesser mystery. In some ways, it is the deeper one. Because it means the country did not merely hide these places, it outgrew them unevenly. It built new surfaces over old functions, then forgot how dependent those surfaces once were on the unseen level below. This is one of the reasons underground spaces exert such a powerful hold over the American imagination. The United States has always been a nation unusually comfortable with reinvention. Towns boom and collapse. Streets are widened. Waterfronts are remade. Commercial centers shift. Factories become lofts. Breweries become restaurants. Hotels become offices. Hospitals relocate. Entire neighborhoods can change identity in a generation or two. Above ground, this can feel like proof of movement, ambition, resilience, or modernity. Below ground, the same process leaves behind fragments that do not fit the current story. A blocked doorway under a polished new development. A forgotten lower level beneath a cheerful downtown district. A brick corridor running under structures whose present-day tenants have no relationship to the world that built it. That contrast matters. The surface tells a story of the present. The underground tells a story of dependence. Above ground, a town presents what it wants seen: prosperity, order, continuity, charm, authority, or renewal. Below ground lie the systems that made daily life work before those visible identities could be sustained. Fuel had to arrive. Waste had to leave. Food had to be stored. Heat had to move. Labor had to circulate. Illness had to be managed. Supplies had to be protected. Goods had to be transferred. People, sometimes, had to move without public attention. The underground does not always preserve a town's ideals. It preserves its necessities. And necessity is a harder thing to memorialize. There are statues for generals and founders. There are plaques for civic milestones. There are guided tours for famous facades, elegant chambers, and celebrated public rooms. Much less often are there loving records of coal corridors, laundry tunnels, service basements, hidden storage chambers, refuse systems, drainage routes, maintenance passages, or the improvised subgrade solutions that held a district together during bad weather, bad sanitation, bad design, or bad times. Yet remove those practical layers, and many admired buildings would never have functioned at all. That is one reason the underground feels morally charged when rediscovered. It reminds the public that visible order always depended on invisible work. Sometimes the invisible work was merely ordinary. Sometimes it was harsh. Sometimes it reflected class divisions built directly into architecture. Sometimes it reflected disease, fear, confinement, or vulnerability. Sometimes it touched the edges of illegality. Sometimes it sheltered people at moments when being seen was dangerous. Sometimes it carried no grand moral meaning at all, only the plain fact that a city is a machine as much as a symbol. But whatever the case, the underground forces a confrontation with the parts of history that did not stand proudly at street level. This is why tunnel stories so often feel heavier than their size should allow. A short corridor can carry a surprising amount of meaning because it compresses so many layers at once. It is physical, but partly inaccessible. It is real, but only partly understood. It hints at labor, secrecy, or adaptation, even when the exact use remains uncertain. It is both evidence and invitation. A tunnel tells us that a forgotten system existed. It also tells us that the surface no longer knows how to describe that system with confidence. In that sense, the mystery is not merely in the tunnel, it is in the break between the tunnel and the language around it. The people who built or used these spaces often needed no legend to explain them. The meaning was obvious because the tunnel belonged to everyday routine. A worker moving fuel at dawn did not think he was participating in a mystery. A hotel employee taking supplies through a service corridor did not imagine future generations standing in that same space with flashlights, wondering if it had once been used for covert trade. A maintenance man servicing steam lines under a campus did not expect the corridor's dark length to one day feel eerie to people unfamiliar with the world of boilers and pipes. Mystery begins later, when familiarity ends. That delayed transformation is one of the great themes of buried history. The most ordinary spaces can become uncanny once the habits that made them ordinary disappear. A bricked opening in a basement wall is just a closed practical feature to one generation and a local legend to the next. A partially buried lower story is just a response to changing street grade until the city forgets the old street existed. A sequence of connected commercial cellars is just efficient urban design until ownership changes, walls go up, and the old passage pattern becomes fragmented enough to feel secret. Time does not merely age these places, it changes the category into which people place them. And because of that, the unresolved tunnels beneath America reveal something larger than themselves. They reveal how history actually survives, not as a perfect archive, but as an uneven survival of materials, habits, reputations, and gaps. We often like to imagine that the past is either preserved or lost. In reality, much of it is preserved in broken form. Enough remains to prove there was a structure. Not enough remains to explain it fully. Enough remains to suggest how a district worked. Not enough remains to restore the whole choreography of people, goods, and intentions that once moved through it. Enough remains to give a legend a foothold. Not enough remains to tell us whether the legend attached itself at the beginning or only much later. That broken preservation is especially powerful underground because subgrade spaces do not decay in the same visible way as surface life. They can remain physically persuasive long after their documentary world has thinned away. A corridor can still look purposeful after its records are gone. A chamber can still feel charged after its users are forgotten. A blocked stair can still imply motion after the destination is sealed forever. The underground, therefore, preserves conviction more easily than explanation. It convinces us that something mattered here. It leaves us working to discover what. Perhaps that is why tunnels are so difficult to leave alone once found. A forgotten room above ground can be absorbed into a building survey and quickly categorized. A forgotten room below ground almost always feels like a challenge. It asks a question more forcefully. Why was this hidden? Where did it go? Who used it? What was happening in this place before the present arrangement of walls, streets, and ownership erased the logic that once held it together? Those questions are not always answerable in full. Yet they pull at the imagination because they expose how thin our confidence can be even in the spaces we think we know best. A person can walk the same block for 20 years and never suspect that under the pavement lies another version of the place. Not a fantasy version, not necessarily a dramatic one, but a version built for colder winters, rougher transport, narrower margins, more visible labor, dirtier energy, more fragile sanitation, less elegant infrastructure, and more immediate adaptation. A version in which service mattered as much as appearance, and in which going underground was not strange at all. The rediscovered tunnel then becomes a kind of historical correction. It reminds the present that the visible city is only the latest arrangement of a much older problem: how to keep life moving through difficult conditions. That is one reason the final lesson of these tunnels is not really about secrecy. It is about continuity. Beneath nearly every mystery lies continuity of need. People needed storage. They needed heat. They needed movement protected from weather. They needed safer transport of goods. They needed hidden service routes in institutions. They needed drainage. They needed places to wait out danger. They needed ways of keeping public order above while private necessity operated below. The forms varied, but the pressures repeated. What historians often uncover, then, is not evidence of a lost world completely separate from the America we know, but evidence of the material struggles by which familiar America was built. And yet, because those struggles were often hidden, delegated, low status, or functional, rather than ceremonial. They were easier to forget. This is where the tunnels touch something almost philosophical. They show that a society's memory is selective not only in what it honors, but in what it thinks worth describing. Whole systems can vanish from ordinary understanding, while their physical traces remain underfoot. A city may remember the opening date of its grand hotel and forget how the laundry moved. It may celebrate the courthouse and forget the basement systems that kept it operating. It may advertise the charm of a historic block, while having almost no public language left for the buried level beneath it. The tunnel, when rediscovered, exposes not just an old passage, but a failure of historical attention. That failure is not uniquely American, of course. Many places build over themselves. Many communities forget the infrastructure of older life. But the American pattern of rapid growth, repeated redevelopment, energetic demolition, improvisation, and civic reinvention has made the contrast especially sharp. Surface change has often happened so aggressively that the underground became one of the few places where earlier practical worlds could remain in place at all. Hidden survival, in other words, was sometimes the only survival available. It is possible, then, to look at these tunnels not as isolated curiosities, but as a kind of national archive. Not a neat archive, not one arranged in boxes and labels. A damaged archive, a partial archive. An archive in brick, stone, damp air, iron fittings, buried doorways, patched ceilings, soot marks, blocked arches, collapsed junctions, and rumors that cling to real walls. Each site preserves one small piece of a larger truth, that beneath the official narrative of America's towns and cities, there was always another level, where work, adaptation, concealment, maintenance, and survival shaped the built world as profoundly as speeches, laws, and facades did. And once that is understood, the tunnels become easier to respect, even when they cannot be fully solved. A historian does not need to explain every inch of a corridor to understand its significance. A community does not need to prove every dramatic local legend to recognize that something meaningful once happened in the hidden architecture below. The incomplete answer is still an answer. It tells us that history survives unevenly. It tells us that the most useful things are often the least celebrated. It tells us that labor can disappear from public memory while remaining built into the bones of a place. It tells us that fear and refuge leave marks even when they leave little paper behind. It tells us that practical design, once detached from its users, can harden into mystery with surprising speed. Most of all, it tells us that the places we inhabit are deeper than their present surfaces suggest. A street is never only the asphalt and storefronts visible now. It is also the grades raised or lowered before, the basements reclassified by time, the forgotten service routes, the demolished neighbors, the sealed connections, the emergency solutions that became permanent, the practical decisions no one thought to narrate carefully, because they seemed too ordinary to matter. The tunnel is simply the moment when that hidden depth becomes undeniable. So, perhaps the final image worth leaving with is not one of revelation, but of quiet coexistence. Above ground, lights in upper windows, delivery trucks backing into alleys, courthouse steps cooling after the day's heat, a hotel lobby polished and bright, a church closing for the night. Apartment windows reflecting the last traffic. Ordinary American life going on exactly as it always seems to go on, complete and self-contained. Below, the older lines remain. A sealed corridor behind a basement wall, a buried lower level once open to the street, a forgotten service route under an institutional block, a chamber whose last clear purpose has been lost. Brick holding the memory of labor, stone holding the memory of adaptation, empty air where goods, heat, fear, or bodies once moved. Not every tunnel leading to revelation, not every legend true. Not every passage solvable, but enough real hidden structure to remind us that history does not disappear when it drops out of sight. It waits. And sometimes, when a wall gives way, when a floor is lifted, when a city repairs a line, when an old building changes hands, the waiting ends for a moment. The present looks downward. A flashlight catches the curve of an old arch. Dust hangs in the air. Someone asks what this place was. Another person offers a story. A historian, more careful, begins sorting what can be known from what can only be imagined. And in that quiet pause, with the visible city above and the buried one below, America appears for what it has so often been, a nation resting not on a single finished surface, but on layer after layer of forgotten necessity. If you have enjoyed this slow journey through the hidden spaces beneath familiar ground, you can subscribe and return for another one when the night is quiet again. I always like hearing where people are listening from and what time the darkness has reached on their side of the world. There is something strangely comforting in knowing that while one city settles into sleep, another is still awake above its own buried corridors, carrying on over histories it may not yet know are there.